Hello, and welcome to Technically Speaking, where scientists and engineers come together to chat about a common interest, share knowledge, and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Antonia, and I'm joined by Ellie and Jasmin to talk about methane emissions from cattle and methods that could reduce the impact on global warming. So, to start with, Ellie, you've got a degree in zoology, but have you thought much about the emissions of cattle?
Not especially in terms of zoology. I think my zoology was much more wildlife based. There was a degree at my university called animal science, which I think focused a lot more on that. But having said that, cow burps, cow farts, they are a pretty hot topic in the world of global warming, climate crisis, all of that stuff. And I've cut down my meat consumption because of the cows and the methane and the global warming. So maybe I'm thinking about it much more than I realise, just not in an academic point of view.
And also, gotta recognise the pun, hot topic on global warming.
That was unintentional, but I'll take it.
But yeah, I've also tried to eat less meat. I've been following the idea of meat as a treat instead of it being a standard component in every single meal. Moving on to resident vegetarian, Jasmine,
Yeah.
or pescatarian, I should say.
On occasion, pescatarian, when I'm forced to eat it by my parents.
I know that feeling too. They don't understand the concept of vegetarianism.
No.
But anyway, back onto your research work, you've looked at how the oil and gas industry could reduce their methane emissions. Did you also do any research on the emissions from cows?
Me personally, no, but in the general methane area, agriculture is a really big area, especially with livestock, so cows, sheep, pigs, etc. In some places, it's agriculture that's the much bigger source of methane than oil and gas. So there are like a number of countries who have made pledges to cut down their methane emissions, and for them it will mean targeting agriculture.
All right. I hadn't really thought about it because most people talk about carbon dioxide or carbon emissions
Yeah.
and forgetting about the other greenhouse gases that are human caused, but human caused in the way that we raise livestock.
Yeah.
So I heard a fact that a cow emits about 100 kilos of methane per year. Is that a lot? You know, it feels like it's a lot.
I mean, for a cow, for an animal like the size of a cow, it's a pretty big number. Annoyingly, there's no real figures of how much methane humans emit from farts and burps, so we can't do a comparison with a human. Yeah, 100 kilograms of methane per year per cow. Think about how many cows there are in the UK and then also other countries. And then also factor in the fact that methane is a really potent greenhouse gas. So over a 100-year time frame, methane is around 30 times stronger than carbon dioxide, and over a shorter time frame, i.e. 20 years, it's around 80 times stronger. So yeah, in terms of CO2 equivalents, it's a lot, it adds up.
There must be enough cows, or at least enough ruminants, the animals that produce methane.
Yeah.
They add up to, again, a rough estimate, between 11 and 17% of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Yep, they do indeed. Yeah, in the UK, agricultural methane is actually the biggest source of methane. From cattle alone, it's about 4 times higher than, like, manure management. So, like, cows, farts and burps, methane is 4 times higher than, like, methane from, basically, manure and that degrading.
The cows can't help farting, burping, okay? We can't just blame the cows.
No, they can't, no.
I mean, there's like over 1 billion cows in the world, easily, and they're just doing it as part of their digestion. They can't actually, like, reduce their own farts and burps themselves.
You should try and hold it in.
I'm sure if you try and hold it in one end, it's going to come out the other.
Yeah.
So basically, they just eat a load of grass, and they have a 4-chambered stomach. And, like, they do a lot of ruminating and a lot of fermentation, and that just produces gas naturally. So yes, they do produce a lot of methane, but I was going to say it's not their fault, but it is their fault. But they can't do anything about it.
Yeah, it's not a process.
But we could do something about it as humans.
Yeah, I mean, most of the cows presumably are farmed, like for livestock.
Yeah, it's our fault that there are so many.
Yes, pretty much.
No, it might sound a little weird, but there's a feed additive that could reduce methane emissions. But there was also a weird conspiracy theory around it. Did you hear about this with Bova?
Oh, is this the Lurpak people, the Arla people?
Yeah, the Arla one.
I think people got the wrong end of the stick, didn't they, really? But the idea was that they were adding this additive to cow feed called like Bova or something. They sort of announced that they were going to be adding this, and then people sort of panicked and then were like, oh my God, it's going to ruin everything and we're going to become very ill from eating all this and we're not going to buy Arla products because it's got this Bova in it. When in reality, I think there was like nothing wrong with Bova. Like it wasn't detrimental to human health in any way.
No, and the thing is, the additive, it gets fully digested, so none of it I would actually like pass on in the meat or the milk from the cows. But also, it's being used in countries outside the UK, and it's been used for quite a while, and there's been no impacts found so far from using it. I think it's people just finding out that, can we call it big cattle or big dairy?
Big cow.
Like, yeah, big cow were like trialing a new chemical, and then people freaked out about new chemicals in their food chain.
Yeah, they don't like chemicals, but they also got a hold of the chemical safety data sheet. It does say this is corrosive to humans, but that was because it was the data sheet for anyone handling the chemical, which is different when it gets digested by a cow.
Yeah, but also, like, a lot of stuff is corrosive to humans. Like, technically lemon juice and vinegar is corrosive to humans.
That's the thing. I think people read stuff like that who maybe don't necessarily have the science understanding, and then sort of it immediately goes from 0 to 100 in like panic. And there were like videos of people like pouring milk dramatically down sinks and stuff, being like, we're going to boycott this substance.
And it's a shame because I feel like that's the opposite of a boycott, because they've already bought the product.
Yeah, it's just wasteful then. I could have drunk that milk. Didn't also Bill Gates got dragged into it as well, didn't he? Because he's like invested in some sort of, not Bova, but like a startup designed to do like a similar thing to like cut methane emissions in cows. And then he was like dragged into it.
And I think because people have a thing about Bill Gates, it then kind of melded together that people had even more of an excuse to get mad about chemicals in their food. And also Bill Gates is, I don't know, making trackers in our drinks allegedly, but I don't think he's interested in that at all.
I think it's just one of those things where it's like becomes a bit of a pile on, doesn't it? As soon as like this one excuse for the Facebook warriors to come out in force.
There's another food additive that does a similar job, which is seaweed. Would people oppose that as much because it's natural?
Well, there was a trial in Sweden. They were selling reduced methane beef, and I believe the cows were fed seaweed as a supplement so that they would have lower methane. And it was really successful, and it sold out in the trial that they ran in 2022. So from that example, I would say probably a lot less resistance because it's seaweed. People know what it is, and also people eat seaweed.
Yeah, I feel like that's better for some reason. Like an unknown mystery chemical is like automatically more scary than just cows eating seaweed to reduce methane. Like that sounds fine to me. Not that the other one doesn't, but you know what I mean? Like it's more palatable. I would eat seaweed to reduce my methane emissions.
I will say that the reason why seaweed works in terms of reducing methane being produced by cows and other ruminants is they basically don't know, they just know it works.
Oh,
they don't know how.
No, they just know it works.
I love stuff like that, where it's like, we don't know how this is working, but we're doing it anyway because we're getting good results.
Yep. Pretty much.
Yeah, I suppose they're not seeing any side effects, though, because otherwise they would probably be concerned.
Yeah, but this is the Bill Gates thing again, because his company, the one he did actually invest in, is a seaweed company for cows. So maybe we have him to thank for this trial.
I think there were also scientists who found which particular breed of seaweed it was, because they reported it has a 60% reduction in methane emissions. So I wonder if that led to the startup, or, you know, they picked up the research and carried on.
Yeah, it could be. Also, the startup is called Ruminate, with an 8.
Of course.
Of course it is. Gotta get more puns in. I think, like, it's weird, isn't it? Seaweed, if that's so good at reducing methane, why is that not the standard across the UK or the world or wherever this study was done? Is it being adopted by, like, more farmers, more countries?
So, while there's been no negative side effects to the animals, it's because, so in seaweed, bromide, or like specifically bromoform and bromochloromethane in the seaweed, because of that, and the possibility of that getting into the milk and the meat, there's some like regulatory concerns around those chemicals.
Is that bad if I was to eat bromide milk?
Don't know is the answer. People eat seaweed. It'll just be like a slightly elevated concentration if you were to get those chemicals from meat and dairy versus just eating seaweed alone.
Yeah.
They have, in some trials, found traces in milk and in urine from the cows, but they've not found any impact on the meat quality.
That sounds good.
Yeah, the main concern is just around what to do with the fact that you do get those bromine chemicals passing through the digestion and ending up in the milk and the meat, and whether or not that's going to be of concern to human health.
So natural is not always better.
Well, it depends on the chemical and what you're concerned about.
Yeah. I think when we were looking at this, we also read that it was harder to produce the seaweed on a mass scale. So there's also that challenge.
Oh, that makes sense. Why then? Getting the seaweed is a big barrier then, presumably. Or like being able to store it or ship it or do whatever they've got to do to get it out of the sea.
Also, all the extra demand for seaweed.
Yeah, does that mean we're going to wreck the sea now? We're aiming to reduce cow burps, but we've inadvertently destroyed the marine ecosystem instead.
To have seaweed farms.
And also, seaweed is a massive, like, carbon sink. Like, kelp is, like, a huge, I don't know what you call it, like a forest, an underwater forest, essentially. It doesn't get the credit it deserves. Those damn trees taking all the glory. But big it up for seaweed.
Yeah, so those are, like, things that you can feed to cows or ways that you can change the diet of cows to basically make them less gassy. But something that you can also do and is an active area of research is selective breeding to have lower methane cows but also sheep. So within species, there is a natural variation in the amount of methane that is produced. I'm pretty sure it also applies to humans. There are definitely people who are more gassy than others. So for sheep and cows, they have identified specific genes that enable them to be able to breed cows and sheep that do have lower methane emissions. And they have found that after 3 generations, there's about 10% reduction in methane per kilogram of animal. I was actually interviewed by ITV. The interview was never aired. But yeah, there's a cow born up in Scotland. I believe she's the 16th generation of cows that have been born to have lower methane. Her name is Hilda.
How long did it take them to get to Hilda if she's 16th generation?
It can't be that cows breed fairly, like, quickly.
I mean, definitely not as long as it would take to get to 16th generation for humans, so that's for sure.
Well, cows have what, like 1 calf a year, probably? 2 calves a year? Doesn't take very long for them to become adult cows. I reckon it's less than 16 years. That's me speculating. If it's like this special program, they could be IVFing cows, which would be a lot faster.
Yeah, they have been using IVF because that's how Hilda was conceived. So because they use IVF, she was conceived about 8 months quicker.
How are they deciding which cows are less gassy to selectively breed them? Like, are they like measuring the cow farts, or is this like a breed that's already less farty in the first place?
So they just screen for genes, is essentially what they do.
Did they notice because some were more smelly than others and were like,
You can measure methane from cows. It looks a bit weird, but you can measure it, similar to how you would measure methane from oil and gas. So there are sensors that will measure the concentration of methane in the air. So if you hold it near a cow, you can get an idea of just like how high the methane concentration is. Obviously, you need to take repeat samples of that. You could also put a cow in a chamber that will just constantly measure the concentration of methane and then the flow rate of methane.
I've seen pictures of this and it looks nuts. It's like a whole thing that fits over their head sort of thing.
Pretty weird.
That's fun though.
I just thought, when they go to sleep in the shed, you could just put a sensor there, right?
Also do it when they're awake.
But I just imagine they're roaming free in the fields, grazing,
Yeah, I think when they actually do take the measurements with the female cows, they tend to take the measurements when they're being milked because the cow's right there.
Yeah, fair. And also they're like used to being like a bit handled and whatever.
Yeah.
Poked and prod.
Is it a good idea or is it a bit odd? Like, I know that they're already livestock and we've probably already bred them to a certain extent, but like, is doing this a sustainable choice to like breed cows to have less farts and burps?
There is a limit to how much you can breed cows so that they will naturally produce less methane without having any detrimental impacts. They have a stomach.
Ruminant stomach.
Yeah.
4 chambers.
That produces methane because it's basically anaerobic digestion happening in that stomach.
Huh.
They're trying to reduce methane in that stomach while also not majorly impacting the cow's ability to digest and process food.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because if you're doing that, then you are fundamentally altering like how a cow works, essentially, aren't you?
There is a limit to how much you can reduce it by. I think it kind of maxes out at around 15%.
Is that enough? I mean, I suppose if a cow is producing, what did you say at the beginning, Antonia, like 100 kg of methane a year?
Yeah.
So 15% is not nothing. And then if you start feeding it seaweed or bova as well,
Yeah.
maybe you could potentially really knock that lower.
Yeah, you can knock it lower, but really the main thing to reduce methane from cows is basically have fewer cows.
Yeah, less demand.
What do you know? Just remove it at the source. But how do you convince people to do that?
To eat less meat.
Make
Yeah.
it really expensive.
Meat tax.
No, honestly, I've paid, this is slightly unrelated, but I paid £4.75 for a packet of smoked salmon. And I haven't done that in ages because it's obscene. And you get like 3 slices and then it's gone. But I reckon steak is already expensive, but if you put it up, people would stop buying it.
That is true. And like in some countries, they are starting to introduce methane tax on livestock. And then the cost would probably transfer down to consumers who...
Are we going to destroy the entire farming industry, though, if we do this?
Yeah, that is a question. Denmark currently has, although they will be introducing a methane tax for livestock. So beginning in 2030, it's both cows and pigs. It's around $100 per cow in 2030, going up to $250 by 2035. Basically, it's a polluter pays tax. So polluter pays, we covered that in the plastic bottle episode earlier this year. And it got passed through in Denmark. Farmers were not too happy, so we shall see whether or not it sticks around, because other countries that did try to introduce it, so Australia, or maybe New Zealand tried to introduce one, but there was just too much pushback from farmers, so they ended up scrapping it.
I mean, to be fair to the farmers, it's not their fault that the cows make a lot of methane, and there's also lots of other companies that we could tax that produce a lot of CO2 and other greenhouse gases.
But I suppose, could that encourage farmers to grow a different kind of food that has a similar nutritional value? I say this as a not farmer, but someone who's looked into sustainability. It's sustainable farming practice to not deplete the soil. You would rotate your crops and you would rotate which field is being grazed on, and then, some would have a rest. Would that encourage them to have better practices and take up the bova or ruminate trials and then find the less gassy cows? Nothing against gassy people, but if we have a choice.
My initial reaction is probably not, right? If you're a dairy or beef farmer and suddenly you get told that you're going to be taxed an extra, 50 quid a cow or whatever, or 50 quid per gallon of milk, you're going to be pretty cross, aren't you? Because that's eating into your profits.
Yeah.
But if they then say you'll be taxed 50 quid per gallon of milk, but if you feed your cows this thing, we won't tax you, maybe it offsets it, but then you still have to pay for the thing. I don't know what you would do in that situation as a farmer.
Also, because it's per cow, it's not per cubic meter or kilogram of methane that's being emitted by the farm. So even if they did start feeding their cows seaweed or other additives or start having lower methane cows, they're still paying the same amount because it's just one number or one amount per cow per head.
And if you've got 300 cows, doesn't matter what you're feeding them, it's still 300 cows.
Yeah, unless they change the figure to be something that would take into account measures farmers could do to reduce methane, then it's probably not going to encourage.
I think that sounds like poorly designed policy, or is it just because it's early days and they will bring that in later on when it's a bit more mainstream? Because it could be these measures are just not widespread enough that they can't offer that, or the government doesn't know enough about it to actually put it into policy.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see what the actual methane tax goes towards, because if it goes towards supporting farmers in other areas and could encourage them to take actions, because if they're paying into a tax but then they can like get money back from the tax to do other stuff, it's not all a loss.
The thing that comes to my mind is if they're being taxed per cow, it's not even just people who eat meat, it's also people who have dairy.
Yeah.
And dairy has benefits as, it doesn't kill the cow. They can still produce a lot of nutritionally rich food with protein, B12, something that you lack when you're a vegan, but is naturally produced is B12 vitamin. So is that actually encouraging the wrong thing out of people?
Yeah, it's a tricky balance. There are scenarios, when I say scenarios, I mean climate scenarios that take into account lifestyle choices. So there are scenarios where people do go fully vegan, but then it's a question of how are people getting all their nutritional needs, and also what happens to all the animals. So it is a balance between trying to combat and fight climate change while also trying to maintain other things that people need to be healthy, like balanced diet, enough nutrition, but also animal welfare.
Yeah, it is hard. Also, eating meat as one individual is not responsible for the entirety of global warming or climate change. There is also many other factors that we haven't mentioned, like CO2 emissions from cars or shipping, loads of other things that are messing up the planet, deforestation, all of that, habitat destruction. So the decision to eat meat or not eat meat is your own personal one, and yes, not eating meat does reduce your own personal carbon footprint, but we're not necessarily suggesting that the whole planet needs to give up eating meat and dairy for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, also in some places of the world, it'd be really difficult to be vegetarian or vegan because you don't have that many options, especially if you're trying to stick to a more regional or local diet.
Is that because they don't have the land that is suitable for alternative? I think of it as the animals that ruminate or have the 4-chamber stomach, they have the ability to digest food that we wouldn't actually be able to.
Yeah. Now I was just thinking of, when I was in China last year, we went to the part of the province I'm from, Sichuan, that borders Tibet, and we tried some Tibetan food. And in Tibet, they eat a lot of meat because you can't grow a lot of vegetables in that area because it's really mountainous, really high elevation, kind of dry most of the year. So, the only thing I could eat was bread and potatoes. I could also drink the buttermilk tea. That was pretty nice. But yeah, I couldn't eat anything else because it was all meat-based.
And there was no fish.
There's also no fish, yeah.
I think also a lot of people sort of are under the misapprehension that animal agriculture is a huge contributor to greenhouse gases, whereas it's not necessarily as big as people think it is, like compared to other things. There's an article in The Conversation that suggests that only 3.9% of the total US greenhouse gas emissions is related to all of animal agriculture. So then if you take out sheep and goats and chickens, then beef presumably and dairy is a lot smaller percentage of even that. So then it's way less. So maybe we shouldn't even be worried about the cows. Maybe we should be focusing on a different area altogether.
But because a lot of countries also pledge to be net zero, and in a lot of decarbonisation scenarios that I've seen, agriculture is more or less the only sector that doesn't actually get to zero, anywhere close to zero by 2050. Most do see a reduction through measures like improving waste management, replacing, electrifying or having zero emission farming equipment and stuff, as well as stuff around reducing methane from livestock. But because agriculture is pretty much the only sector that doesn't actually reach net zero, to actually get to net zero you then need to look into land-based methods, so increasing your carbon sinks, peatland restoration, afforestation. It's in general just really difficult to actually get to net zero. It's going to be pretty much impossible unless we stop having livestock at all. So I think that's kind of why people are really interested in it.
If you were in charge of all beef and dairy production for the world, what would you do? Would you make people just farm less cows in the first place? Would you force them to feed their cows these additives? Would you make them selectively breed their cows to burp less? Would you scrap the whole global beef industry?
I would make it so that all the cows can be free range and no more intensive farming for the cows and sheep and pigs and chickens.
That's a very noble goal. What would you do, Antonia? You're effectively the queen of dairy and beef.
Ooh,
You might get lynched.
okay, politically, am I elected and am I up for a re-election, or am I just doing this one thing?
You don't have to stand for re-election.
You're the
Okay.
queen of big dairy and meat.
Big cow.
Big cow.
I feel like culturally, meat seems to be very much a part of cultures around the world. I don't necessarily agree that everyone has to eat meat to be a full human, to be a full person. You know, some people think vegetarians and vegans don't have the full spectrum of life, even. But yeah, because I see the benefit in Tibet. You can't grow any other food, then what else are you going to eat? So I think you're just going to have to do all the measures, but you will have to pay for it in some way.
No, I think that's the thing with all of these things. There is no one measure that you could justifiably use for every different country, every different scenario.
But freedom for the cows would be great. No more intensive farming.
What do you think, Ellie?
Yeah, I think it's too difficult to just put any one measure on it. I think you could do everything and still not really alter the output that much or reduce the methane that much. I think we should focus on other areas. I defend the cows. I'm with Jasmin. Let's get rid of intensive farming, especially the way the Americans do it. Let the cows roam free. Everyone can eat less meat, not necessarily no meat, and then we'll start ramping up those horrible big polluters. Isn't it like something like 57 companies are responsible for most of the global warming in the world or something, most of the emissions in the world?
Yeah, about right.
Let's get rid of them and leave the cows alone.
I think that's a good place to leave it. We've now freed all the cows, freed all livestock, and all animals will be free roaming. But if you wanted to know how we got to this place, we were first talking about how much cattle produces methane and how it does have an impact on global warming. Estimates are out about how much, but farmers can use feed additives, doesn't come through into the dairy or meat product. The alternative is genetic selection. Thank you for listening, and we'll hope to see you in another episode.
The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.